Jacksonville, Florida. This week doing reconstruction following the hurricane. And just remember them in your prayers. I think they'll be home Saturday, Saturday night. So we're looking forward to hearing from Charles. And last night we had an ordination examination council for Susan Bowles, and she just squeaked by barely. And it was a beautiful night. It was a great experience. And the ordination council was very enthusiastic of their endorsement of her and her call to ministry. So there's wonderful things happening in our church family. I want to ask you a question. How many of you think that in the recent conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which side has experienced more casualties? Who thinks the Palestinians have had more casualties than the Israelis? Let's see your hand. Who thinks the Israelis have had more casualties than the Palestinians? Let's see your hand. Just one. All right.
Are you talking about the overall period? Or are you
I'm talking about, let's say, in the last 50 years. Who do you think has had more casualties, the Palestinians or the Israelis?
Define Palestinians.
Arabs who live in Israel. Palestinians. Who do you think Palestinians have had more casualties?
Arabs in Israel.
Who do you think the Israelis? A bunch of you aren't voting. All right, you're afraid it's a trick question.
I don't know.
I go with the Palestinians.
Well, we're going to find out.
The Israelis have better guns.
They have guns. That's one of the things. The Palestinians don't have guns. Okay. So this is night 4, and I'm going to have to move quickly because we've got some really important things to talk about, but we're really in the modern times in our conversation tonight, in understanding what is the conflict in the Middle East. You know, we talked about the rise of Zionism, right? This is the idea that the Jews deserve a homeland and they deserve to go back to the territory given to Abraham, even though Abraham was given all the way over to the Euphrates River, but they never occupied that, but to go back to Israel. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 was a British declaration that they deserved a homeland. And after the end of World War I, Great Britain was given control of Palestine. Now those three things together, and the migration back of Jews from around the world to this very small strip of land, caused a lot of panic for the Palestinians who had been living there for centuries. And in 1929, open war broke out. Now, that's a way for me to say it had not been the norm. This part of the world has not been. The Arabs and the Israelis have not been fighting. They lived together peaceably. But starting in 1929, they began to interact violently. And precipitating on the Israeli side were Israeli terrorist groups who were fighting against the British. Because the British were trying to bring peace, and so they were trying to limit Israeli Jewish immigration. At the end of the Second World War, we all know what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust. The world took up the Jewish cause in 1945, and the Brits were really tired of the whole problem. And they referred this problem to the United Nations. And on Thursday, November 29th, 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine. Now look at this map. It's important that you see this map because this is what the United Nations voted. The blue would be Israel, and the pink would be Palestine. And you see there is a pink strip along the Mediterranean. You see that? And a tiny little link between another pink section along the Jordan River. You see that? And that connection was just a road, but a way to say the Palestinians would have the area called Gaza connected by a road to the area known as the West Bank. And so that pink section on the Jordan River, when you hear the words West Bank, that's what we're talking about. There's another pink section at the top, which is Galilee. Okay. This is what the United Nations decided. And so in 1948, Britain withdrew. Let me say one other thing. The city of Jerusalem was to be governed by an international council. It was not either Palestinian or Israeli. It was to be an international city. Not unlike probably Berlin. The idea that Berlin was going to be an international city governed by an international coalition. That was in 1947. 1948, on May the 14th, the State of Israel declared its independence. And that is their Independence Day, May 14, 1948. On that day, the first Arab-Israeli war began. Because the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, began to clear out Palestinian villages in land that was given to Israel. And by clear out, I mean literally the Palestinian Arabs who were living there were put on trucks and shipped to refugee camps. That was resisted by a coalition of Arab countries with Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt, plus the local Palestinians. Let's see, there's one more. Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt. And I don't know, I'd have to go back and find out. There are 5 Arab nations. 711,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes. In order to understand what this is like, I want you to imagine that Native Americans were given permission by the United Nations to come and knock on your door without any deed or proof and say, my family owned this property hundreds of years ago, and now it's mine. Now, can you imagine what you would feel like if Native Americans showed up at your house and said, I'll take that, it's mine now. Your orchard that had been in the family for generations, your grove, your olive trees, remember olive trees live thousands of years. Your olive trees, your houses, your barns, your churches, because these are also Christians, Palestinian Christians, and your mosques. And those families left only with their keys. And to this day, Palestinian refugees, who are some of them still living in refugee camps, pass their keys down from one generation to the next with a hope that one day they will go back and claim their family's home. And so I showed you a picture of graffiti on a wall that I took in a refugee camp outside Bethlehem to show this key passing from one generation to the next. And you see the tree of life that's breaking the wall, the painting. The tree of life is breaking this wall, and the tree is showing the Dome of the Rock. Remember we talked last week about how important the Dome of the Rock is? The dream that they would have access to the Dome of the Rock again, and the tents symbolizing camps. The Israelis thought that the other Arab countries would take them in, and they did not. And you have to say, you have to put some blame on the Arabs at that point. The Palestinians are they are not welcome by reputation and by bloodlines in the other Arab countries. They are. Remember, I said to you that many of these Palestinians are the mixed bloodlines of all the indigenous people that came through. But the Egyptians think of themselves as pure-blooded Egyptians, and the Syrians as pure-blooded Syrians, and the Lebanese as pure-blooded Lebanese. And the Palestinians were not welcome.
They didn't arrest you for taking those photographs?
No, I was in the refugee camp.
Oh, okay.
No, I was in the Palestinian camp with the
Sometimes they
Palestinian guy.
confiscate film and...
No, I was in friendly territory. I was in the Palestinians with a Palestinian guide.
And as I mentioned too, in one of the earlier ones, having spoken with the Syrian about the ongoing issues, is that the Syrian that I was speaking to actually said, yeah, the Palestinians or the group of the West Banks also included a significant population, really, of people from Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, whatever, that were essentially undesirable prisoners, political prisoners or whatever, that were then given the choice of either execution or basically going into these settlement areas of like the West Bank, which of course meant basically they had to stay, they couldn't come back. And even with the existing issues we have now, the Syrian spoke about, well, the Syrian government, as they're doing right now by bombing or basically blitzkrieg of a city, at the time that he was growing up, same thing happened. There were undesirables in a city. Syrian government surrounded that city and basically told the city population, either you hand them over or die. Well, the population initially resisted, so the Syrians bombed the entire city out of existence. Didn't matter who you were, they just basically surrounded it so you couldn't leave, and then killed everyone in the city. That was their method of eliminating
The undesirables. The war ended in 1949 with a new map, and so I gave you a new map. Compare that little map to that map. Do you see anything different? Do you see the West Bank is severely diminished? You see that Galilee in the north is no longer Palestinian, and Gaza has been reduced to a very small strip along the Mediterranean. Also, what's missing is any contiguous link between Gaza and the West Bank. Just think of it this way: how can you form a country and have two sections of the country that have no land connection? That would be very, very difficult to do. So the War of Independence ended in 1949. The next big debate, the next big conflict was with Egypt over the Suez Canal. And this map shows you why the Suez Canal was important. If you were in London, Great Britain, or France, and you wanted oil from the Middle East, it was 7,000 miles to get there from India, or the oil states in the Red Sea. You see that word 7,200 miles? Right above that word miles is the Red Sea. These are the Red Sea states. If you want oil to go from the oil-producing countries to the industrial factories of Great Britain and France, you either went 12,000 miles around Africa or 7,000 miles through the Suez Canal. If you watch that series, that same series I mentioned on PBS with Billy Graham and Queen Elizabeth, there was a night dedicated to the Suez Canal crisis. When France and Great Britain attacked the Egyptians at Suez Canal, in response to President Nasser closing the canal to Western traffic. Okay, this is a big, fat, hairy deal. The other thing was, Britain still had empire in India, and they wanted access to that empire. This was all about empire and oil. Now, the Brits and the French were successful, but the United States and the USSR and the United Nations embarrassed them, and they were forced to withdraw. So in this case, the Egyptians won. The result, the only winner in this, well, of course the Egyptians won, but the only winner was this, is that the Soviet Union now had an opportunity to come in and to try to be seen as an ally of the Arab countries. Politics, right? So now it's the Arab countries versus Israel, but now it's also Russia versus the United States. You see how all that is heating up. This is the 1950s. In 1967, President Nasser announced that the same Suez Canal was going to be closed to Israeli vessels. And so Israel launched a preemptive strike, and they were very successful. This is called the Sixday War. And in 1967, the map changed again. You see the map on the left before the war, the map on the right after the war. Because now Israel occupies the entire Sinai Peninsula, including the Suez Canal. And they are now occupying the West Bank. Palestinians are no longer in self-control. After the Sixday War, they lost full autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War was a war launched by a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria on two pieces of real estate. The Sinai Peninsula, and there's a typo there. It should have said the Sinai, not the Syrian Peninsula, the Sinai Peninsula. My mistake. Egypt wants the Sinai Peninsula back. And remember, Israel doesn't really claim to have birthright to the Sinai Peninsula. But they want it because this is how they maintain control of the Suez Canal. At the top right, you see, and the map on the right, you see the word Golan. The Golan is a mountain range between Syria and Israel. Israel really never claimed the Golan, but they wanted it as a buffer between Damascus and Israel. This surprise attack came on Judaism's holiest day, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. The U.S. is supporting the Israelis. The Russians are supporting the Arabs. And that almost came to a blow between those two superpowers. Israel gained the Golan, and Egypt regained part of the canal, but not the entire Sinai. And there's a map here that shows you that Israel regained part of the Sinai, but Egypt got a big piece of it back. But Israel gained the Golan in this process. In fact, Israel gained property within 20 miles of Damascus. This is the situation in 1978 when Jimmy Carter and Prime Minister Begin and Egyptian President Sadat met at Camp David. There's a new book out last year, 14 Days of the Camp David Peace Accords. At Camp David, the new treaty said, Egypt gets the Sinai back. And they did. And it said that 5 years after the Palestinians maintain autonomy of their own area, governmental autonomy, they have to have free and fair elections. They have to show that they're capable of maintaining a stable government. 5 years after that, Israel will withdraw from the West Bank and restore autonomy to the West Bank. That was the deal. There was no conversation about the status of Jerusalem. No conversation in the Camp David Accords about whether Palestine would ever become a nation. It's just what I just said. The United Nations invalidated this accord because they said that Egyptian President Sadat does not have the authority to make commitments on behalf of the Jordanians, King Hussein. The Jordanians were not at all happy that the Egyptian president was saying, well, the Jordanians can control what's happening on that side. What happened at the Camp David Accords is Egypt and Israel came to peace, and they're still at peace with each other. The Egyptians and the Israelis are not at war. And the United States gained a much closer relationship with the Egyptians from the Camp David Accords. In fact, Sadat and Begin shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1978. But in 1981, Sadat was assassinated by his own security detail, who was part of an Islamic Jihad group, because he had made peace with Israel. In 1988, Palestine declared their independence. They declared themselves that their intention was to become a future Palestinian state. That has never been finalized, but that's the dream.
Did they define the borders that they were looking for? Do you remember?
I don't think so. I think what it said, I'll have to go back. Let me tell you, each one of these has like 100,000 books written on it.
Yeah.
And even the Wikipedia is, when you print it out, is that thick. But I'm pretty sure that it said Jordan and Israel can work out their borders. And Jordan's like, don't put that on us. You don't have the power to put that on us. The Israelis are occupying the West Bank at this time. The Palestinians are led by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who was led by whom? You know the name? Yasser Arafat. He is leading the Palestinians. He, of course, has very few nice things to say about the Israelis, and they have nothing nice to say about him. The Israelis are occupying Palestine, and they are not an autonomous country, territory. And so it caused an enormous amount of stress in the community. The Israelis let the Palestinians work on the Israeli side of the line, but only in the lowest of the labor jobs. You have highly educated Palestinian leadership working far below their abilities in economic oppression, military presence. And so the First Intifada was a protest movement. Intifada means uprising. And so the First Intifada was strikes. The Palestinian workers went on strike. They were boycotting Israeli government officials. They refused to work in Israeli settlements. They refused to pay their taxes. They refused to drive cars that had Israeli licenses. They were doing graffiti. They were doing barricades, and they were throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails. Molotov cocktail, you remember, is a gasoline bomb.
Yes.
And they were throwing them at the Israeli installations inside the West Bank. Are you with me? You see that? Israel deployed 80,000 soldiers, and in the first 13 months killed 332 Palestinians. And in that same amount of time, 12 Israelis were killed. Is that what you hear on the news? There was a very high proportion of children and youth and civilians, not Palestinian military, who were beaten with the idea that this is going to be how we're going to break the Palestinians' bones. In the first year, 311 Palestinians were killed, and a third, 20% or so, were under the age of 17. Save the Children, an organization, said that 7% of Palestinians under 18 years of age suffered injuries. In 6 years of the First Intifada, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, killed anywhere from 11 to 1,200 Palestinians. And anywhere between 23,000 and 29,000 Palestinian children needed medical treatment. In those same years, 100 Israeli civilians and 60 IDF personnel were killed. And more than 1,400 Israeli civilians and 1,700 soldiers were injured. You see how out of weight this is. The Israelis have all the power. Why did they do it? I'm not going to read all of these, but there's some interesting stuff here. The first is there was just intense stress and pressure because of the Israeli crackdown. Let me ask you, the Israelis are demolishing houses. They are uprooting trees. Remember, an olive tree is sacred in this part of the world. Olive tree is food and medicine and wood and its family legacy. They're mowing down olive trees. The Israelis are mowing down groves of Palestinian olive trees. They are detaining without trial, and it's causing stress. They are frustrated because there are no jobs. Palestinians are being denied access to the good jobs. What do you think Israel is trying to do?
Why are they doing
What is Israel, I want you to think about this. What is Israel hoping will happen? That people will leave.
Give up.
That they will give up and that they will leave. And a large group of Palestinians left. Got any good ideas who those were? They were the Christians. You remember on the day of Pentecost, in the second chapter of the book of Acts, when it lists the countries who were at the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem, it says the Arabs. These folks had been Christians since the day of Pentecost. They're living in Palestine, and they are leaving because they can. They can leave because churches around the world are taking them in. Who cannot leave? The Palestinian Arab Muslims cannot leave.
Because the Muslim countries will not.
Because the Muslim countries are not taking them in.
Will.
The Christians have a place to go. The Muslims do not. It's called iron fist policy of cracking down on any sense of Palestinian nationalism. Now there's something else happening. The settlers are coming in. And I think if you get nothing else out of our conversation tonight, you need to understand who the settlers are. I think there's a picture there. I looked out, that was the view out of my hotel room in Bethlehem, 2014. And you can see the industrial complex of Bethlehem, shops and homes. And then do you see there is a concrete wall? Do you see the concrete wall? Right up against the buildings. On top of the hill is this beautiful new subdivision. And as an American, I look at that and say, look, isn't that marvelous? There is prosperity here. It's Norton Commons on top of this hill. Until you understand that this is an illegal Israeli settlement on Palestinian land that has been stolen. And it starts with a couple of trailers, mobile trailers, and then a couple more. And then they come in and they start building roads. And then they come in and they start building houses. And the people who are living in this planned community, and these are beautiful homes, really, really nice homes. I mean, any of us would be happy to live in these homes. Who is living in these homes are Israeli settlers, nearly all of them immigrants from another country, Russians, Ethiopians, Romanians, Jews coming from different countries of the world, who are being offered low-cost housing in these brand new settlements. And they are living on this land that is identified by the international community as in the West Bank. You see what I'm saying? Do you see how that's a problem?
Illegal.
It's illegal settlements. Even the United States says it's illegal settlements. Even Jared Kushner, in this past year, said to his father-in-law, the Americans need to speak about these illegal settlements on West Bank land. And they are going at record paces.
Another war.
And did I put in here how many?
Well, of course, as long as there exists other war between the different factions of the Arabs, it leaves the Israeli community open to do that, because there is no one really involved to actually oppose it.
Well, there is no Palestinian army to speak of. They have no weapons. This is why, when there is a dust-up, the Palestinians throw rocks. There is a guard tower at the corner by my hotel in Bethlehem. Let me say, being in the West Bank, I walked perfectly safely by myself every night. In the dark. I could shop, I could do anything I wanted by myself in the Palestinian side.
Who can take up this cause? The
Well,
United-
let's keep talking, and then we'll talk about
United Nations?
when we're going to march on Jerusalem next week. No. But there was a guard tower in the wall. We haven't got to the wall yet. There's a guard tower in the wall, and something had happened, and the Palestinians were very unhappy. And so there was a demonstration right outside our hotel where the conference was being held. And so all of us Americans raced upstairs and pressed our faces to the glass because we've never seen anything like this in our lives. Because the Palestinians are in the streets with their faces covered with a keffiyeh, scarf, and they're throwing rocks. And the IDF comes out of their guard tower in full gear, Kevlar, the whole shebang, carrying, what do they carry, Uzis?
Yeah.
And they're shooting tear gas to back off these 18-year-old guys who are throwing rocks. That's why do the Palestinians tolerate these illegal settlements? Because they have no options. They have no weapons. They cannot stop Palestinian expansion. And I don't think I put on, I guess I didn't put in here, how many now live, how many are in, there's something like 300,000 Israelis who now live in these illegal settlements. There are 200 or so settlements in the West Bank. Now, when Americans are on buses, we look over there, Shannon, and we see those settlements and we think, isn't that nice? That's Norton Commons right over there. Not realizing those are illegal settlements on stolen land. That is the West Bank. That belongs to the Palestinians of the West Bank. But there's more. I put on here several articles about why are they doing this? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. They want to flood the population. And if they ever say, at any point where there's the majority Israelis in an area, that's when they say, okay, now we're going to have free and fair elections, and now the Palestinians are the minority, and the Israelis are the majority, and you now have elected a free and fair election of a democracy. You can say that. Now, I will say this. Israel has been known to dismantle settlements. When they gave the Sinai back, they dismantled. When they gave some of the Golan back, they dismantled. Because pretty much as soon as they take over land, what do you start doing? You start moving people in. It's exactly what the Babylonians did. Exactly. They just settled their own people. It's what you do. When a new superpower takes control, you settle people in there because now you've got your own people there in this land. Now there is a religious dimension to this that we cannot ignore. Many of these Israelis are what we would call secular Jews. And I don't mean that in any way ugly. I mean they are not terribly devout. You know, they practice the holidays, but this for them is more political than religious. But these secular, and they're religious, but we're not talking hyper-Orthodox, we're not talking the severe, even keeping kosher all the time. They have found an ally in American and British right-wing evangelicals. Do you know the name John Hagee?
Cornerstone Baptist Church.
John Hagee is one of these preachers that you see on TV a lot, and he has become a massive voice for the proliferation of Israel. So why do you think it is? He is extremely conservative religiously. What is his reason?
Millennialism.
He believes that they are establishing the future kingdom of Jesus. And so there is a connection between American right-wing evangelicalism, prophecy, these prophecy guys, and the secular Jews, political Jews, who have formed an alliance. And Hagee is going to Israel all the time, doing preaching conferences and taking groups. We've got to reclaim Israel because Israel belongs to the Jews. All of Israel. When you buy a map, I have a topographical map of Israel in my office that I really like, but it shows no division of the West Bank or Gaza. This is all Israel. You see the competing visions here? In 2000 began the Second Intifada. Moshe Dayan was a general who marched in military fatigues, not in a worship stance, but in a military stance, marched onto the Dome of the Rock, the platform where the Dome of the Rock stands, which the Jews claim and is indeed the site of the temple. What is the symbolism of an Israeli general marching in military wear onto the platform of the Dome of the Rock? What's the imagery there?
It's declaring war, actually.
And that's what happened. Basically, he was saying, this is our Temple Mount and we're taking it back.
Bring it on.
And it caused what we call the Second Intifada. That started in 2000. And this evolved into guerrilla suicide attacks inside Israel. And it was a very unpleasant time. Now, we haven't talked about the Oslo Accords, but the Oslo Accords took the West Bank and drew it into 3 zones: Zone A, Zone B, and Zone C. And it said that as certain benchmarks happen, Israel will relinquish control of these zones to the Palestinian Authority. The PLO has now been replaced by the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority, as they take control, then Israel will relinquish control and withdraw from Zone A first, and then Zone B, and then eventually Zone C. Do you think that ever happened?
Nope.
Did Israel ever withdraw from a zone? No. And so it was stress from that. Remember, Palestine doesn't have an army, they don't have tanks, they don't have machine guns, they don't have planes.
No defense.
The IDF has all of those things, and what does Palestine have? They have suicide bombers. The death toll from the Second Intifada is estimated to be 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis. When Mahmoud Abbas was elected as the president of the Palestinian Authority, it began a de-escalation and the end of the Second Intifada. Elected. There was a fair election. Now, Israel said, we're going to do something different. How novel is this? We're going to build a wall. And they begin construction of a 440-mile concrete barrier. There's some details here. There are actually at least 3 different forms of barriers in this wall. And I was reading today, the contractors for this wall are bidding on Trump's wall. It was really interesting because they said, this is what we've done before. And let me say to you, Israeli technology is above the United States. I mean, they are technologically superior in every way. Militarily superior, the sophistication of their equipment. This wall is so high-tech And I would say, at least at Bethlehem, the wall is probably 30 feet tall. Sharon, you remember that wall? About 30 feet tall, 8 feet thick, concrete with guard towers and barbed wire. And so in the year 2000, they started building the wall with the design that they would eventually completely encapsulate the West Bank. There's no airport in the West Bank. If you're a Palestinian Christian living in the West Bank, where are you going to go to the airport if they close the wall? You're not. Well, what you're going to do is you're going to go to Jordan and fly out of Amman, which is what they do. So the wall is, when it's finished, it'll be 440 miles long. There are 99 fixed checkpoints in the West Bank, in the wall and inside the West Bank, and 288 flying checkpoints. What that means is they're mobile checkpoints. So that the Israeli military, at any time, a day or night, can throw up a checkpoint and check the identity of every person going through that checkpoint. Which means the Palestinians have no self-autonomy on control of movement. If they want to visit, if they want to go to dinner up in Ramallah or visit grandma over in Nablus, they may or may not make that happen. You want to get to a hospital in Bethlehem, you want to get to the hospital in Bethlehem, that may or may not happen. That means Palestinians who are dependent, like everybody else, on tourism may or may not be able to get out of the West Bank to go to work in the hotels in Jerusalem. May or may not be. Or to open their shop in the Old City. Or to get to their job making the olive wood things. It is true that suicide attacks have dropped off dramatically. The Israelis say it's because of the wall. The Palestinians say it's because we decided to stop. It was not doing us any good. And in reality, what happened is it became a PR nightmare to the world. Because Americans began to say Palestinian means terrorist. Right?
Yep.
Haven't people said that to you? Haven't you thought that? The truth is that Hamas was able to become a significant political arm and is working more on human development.
Okay. Hamas is not the PLO.
Hamas is the party in control of the PA. Now, I want to show you, there's a picture I took right here, and you can barely, let me try to explain to you. I went with my friend Kamal to his family farm, and the wall, the security wall, goes up along the back of their family farm. There is razor wire and that concrete barrier, and that's the wall. And even I could have stepped on the other side of that wall. Do you really think the wall is what is keeping the Palestinians from the suicide bombings in Jerusalem?
They tunneled under it.
Oh, sure. So on the back page, here is an Israeli security tower. And then there's a picture of young adults climbing the wall. Because they're too young to go over, I think you have to be 21 maybe at certain times of the day. And they're 18-year-olds, and so they put a ladder up and they climb over the wall. That yellow chart is Israel's argument that the wall works. But the most important thing probably in this is at the bottom. And you see this in posters. People buy this in posters. In 1947, the green was Palestine. After partition in 1947, the green is still Palestine. After the 1967 war, the green is Palestine. And the present day, The settlements and the land under Israeli control is in white, and that's what Palestine looks like today. Okay. We got 2 minutes for questions.
In the Bible, it tells us that those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who condemn Israel will be condemned. How do we fit into that?
Let's talk about who Israel is. What does Paul say who Israel is now? Who are God's chosen?
Romans chapter 2.
Says,
Christians are Israel. Clear, very clear.
we talk out of both sides of our mouth. Israel is God's chosen people. Wait, no. Christians are the new Israel. I think we have to say, and I want to say one other thing after I say this. We have to say, do we really want to make that argument anymore that God still sets aside Israel for this land, even though the Apostle Paul makes a very strong argument, there is a new Israel.
Okay,
But
so
the
that
other-
part of the Bible is no longer true. Is that what you're saying?
What are you going to do with the New Testament? What are you going to do with Paul saying, we are now Israel. We have been grafted in. What are you going to do with that?
True.
Okay. Does that negate the Old Testament? The other thing I want to say to you is, the Old Testament is full of prophetic utterances about justice and mercy and welcoming the stranger in your midst. And I think if we're going to read the passages about Israel as they deserve the land, we have to also read the words of the prophets saying to Israel, you need to remember that you are tending orchards that you did not plant. You are picking olives from trees you did not groom. Deuteronomy. You have to live with justice and mercy for the people among you. Now, Americans don't have a lot of room to talk when we look at the way we treated Native Americans. We certainly didn't treat them with justice and mercy. Now, let me say to you, I have given you a 45-minute, incredibly brief overview of the topic. And there's so much more that you need to read. But I guess my point tonight is, what we read in American papers and in American preaching may not be the whole story.
I think it would be very helpful if we stopped calling it the Old Testament and started calling it exactly what it says, the Old Covenant, as opposed to the New Covenant, in my blood which is shed for you. And he was looking at the new Israel when he said it.
And in the new Israel, the promised land is the whole world.
It's everything.
The new heaven and the new earth.
That's a can of worms.
We have one more night to massage this. Greg.
I'm going to make this point, and it's not justifying anything. But I think we need to understand too that the current day Israelis, those who were part of 47, 48 and all that, learned their lessons well. Because what they have done was exactly what was done to them.
Absolutely.
At the Holocaust and the pogroms, and again, I'm not trying to justify anything, but they learned their lessons. And as one rabbi's, a very orthodox rabbi told me, Israel will not be treated that way again.
Never again.
I'm glad you said that. The Israeli military's watchword is, never again. Never again will Jerusalem fall. And people say to me, aren't you afraid in Israel? Good heavens, no, I'm safer there than I am on the streets of Louisville. Their security, they don't mess around. There's no sense of, I mean, you don't get away with anything. It's extremely security conscious. Sharon's been there, Shannon's been there. Did you feel unsafe, Sharon?
No.
They don't mess around. Anybody else been there in here? I feel perfectly safe there. The moment you hit the ground, there are a million eyes on you. And, but when you're in the Palestinian, when you're in the West Bank, you do feel the oppression. There aren't jobs, because it's hard to get through the checkpoints to get a job on the Israeli side. The Israelis have the money. The Palestinians are very poor. When we shop when we travel in the Middle East and we shop, we try to always do our big shopping on the Palestinian side, because the people have no money. Tourists are terrified on the Palestinian side until they get there and they realize how wonderful these people are. I don't know if you've been around Arab cultures before, but hospitality and generosity are landmarks of Middle Eastern culture. The Israelis too. The Israelis call themselves sabra, a cactus, prickly on the outside and soft and tender on the inside. And there's a lot of truth in that. I've heard Israelis discussing with each other where they're going to have lunch, and you think they're going to kill each other. It is a different world they live in, and well, anything else? I could talk all night.
Political Israel is separate from religious Israel.
Do not think that everyone in Israel's motives are religious.
They're not.
Some are, but some are political. Remember what I said to you the very first night? This is all about real estate. This is not about religion. This is not Arabs versus the Jews. This is the Palestinians versus the Israelis. All right, we'll keep having this conversation at least one more night, and so bring your comments and questions next week, and we'll have some. I won't prepare as much next week, and we'll have some opportunity to just reflect on this night.